Whilst Adnams Distillery might be a relatively new player when looking at the world of whiskey, their roots as a craft producer run deep as they've been brewing beer here in Southwold since 1872. So when it comes to crafting quality products, it's safe to say they know what they're doing. Today, we're diving into the heart of the distillery, exploring each stage of the process and finding out what makes Adnams whiskey truly stand out. Guided by their head distiller, Fergus, I can't wait to see how this English whiskey comes to life. I'm here with the production director, Fergus. Fergus, thank you so much for taking the time to show us around today. We are stood in front of a beast of a mill here. It's certainly not a Porteous or a Bobby like we're used to seeing. Tell us a little bit about this.
So this is a wet conditioning mill. So again, I guess you've got to put us in the fact that we're a brewery, and this went in 2007 when we hadn't even thought about putting a distillery in. For sure. It hadn't crossed our minds.
Okay.
So this was put in for the brewery. It's a wet conditioning mill, which means that the top chamber up there, just as the grain's coming down, it sprays a small amount of water on it. Okay. And what that means is the husk of the grain then becomes a bit more pliable. Right. So when it goes through the rollers of the mill, it doesn't crack the husk. It sort of smooths it out
nicely.
So you end up with a much more intact husk, which for brewing, what the real important part of that is that you don't get the sort of polyphenols, the tannins breaking out of the husk into the beer. Right. But you have the same effect in the whiskey as well, in the wash for the whiskey. You have much less of that polyphenol breaking out. Okay. But essentially, other than that, it's the same. Same process. Okay. What we're trying to do is break it open so the enzymes in the barley can break down that starch into sugar.
And so, whether it's for the beer going stuff through the brewery or for your spirits, it's all going through this mill. Exactly. The mill doesn't change. There's no change in the rotors, the grind size, none of that.
No, it's a set gap size between the rollers. It probably takes us about 3 hours to change the size, which we'll do every season. So when the new season's malt comes in, we'll adjust it then. But typically, it stays the same for 6 months.
Once you've got it, it's good to go. Yeah. Fantastic. All right. Really, really interesting to see this. Out of interest, have you ever had a Bobby or a Porteous?
Yeah, so when I joined in 2004, we had a Bobby mill. Okay. And it was, like every Bobby mill up in the country, probably 100 years old. And there was nothing wrong with it, so we sold that to another brewery, I think Jennings Brewery, we sold it to. But when we moved to the new brew house, we decided we needed something a bit more efficient and needed a bit more capacity than we could get out of the Bobby, so we moved to the mill style.
So it's all about the production levels going up. I mean, as reliable as the Bobbies are, sometimes, this sort of piece of machinery is definitely next level.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Okay, so we've done the milling. Yep. Where are we off to next?
So we're going to go upstairs and see the mash tun and the lauter tun.
Fantastic. Show me the way. All right. We're now at the mash tun where we're going to get all of those starches turning into sugars.
Exactly.
This is a big old mash tun. What size is this?
So this holds about 7 ton of grain.
Okay, 7 tons, wow.
So obviously for the brewing side of things, that really relates to the volume we get out. So we're much more interested in the volume on the beer side than necessarily on the whiskey. Okay. But that gets us about 300 barrels worth of beer.
Okay. And how many mashes are we doing a week then?
So we'll do up to about 20 a week. Obviously not all of that's for the spirit side.
No, I'd imagine most of it going to the beer,
The majority is beer, so out of the 20, probably 17 will be for beer, and the other 3 will be for spirit.
3 for spirits, and of that going towards the spirit, is it predominantly whiskey, or is it an even spread?
It is at the moment, so of the 3, probably 2 of those are only for whiskey, and then 1 might be for vodka, and then into gin. Okay, and you say at the moment, is there something particularly going on? Well, we're doing a bit of contract work at the moment for someone else who are making a lot more whiskey than we normally would at this time of year.
Okay. Should you share who that's with, or is it a trade secret?
Absolutely not.
No, trade secrets. Fair enough. You've got to ask. If you don't ask, you don't get. Okay. Nevertheless, though, 3 big mashes going towards your spirits, most of it going towards your whiskeys. And is there anything different going on here from the beer side of the mash to the whiskey side of the mash?
Yeah, so the temperatures we use are different. So this is obviously some steam jackets on the outside so we can raise the temperature up here. Yeah. For beer, we're always interested in leaving some more complex sugars in there. Not for every beer, but for most beers, we want to leave some complex sugars in there that our yeast can't ferment, or they can ferment very slowly. Okay. Obviously for whiskey, that's not what we need. So we want to make really simple sugars. Okay. So the temperatures we use in here are usually lower, so usually sort of 64 degrees Celsius, 65 degrees Celsius. Because we want to turn as much of that starch into really simple sugars. Fantastic. And particularly when we get to our yeast, that's important because our yeast can't ferment all the complicated sugars. It can only really ferment those simple sugars.
So the whiskey is low and slow?
Yeah, low and slow in here.
Fantastic.
So longer times, lower temperatures.
Fantastic, okay. So we get the mashing done.
Yep.
And on we go. What's next?
And then on to Lautering.
Fantastic.
Which might not be usual in most whiskey distilleries, but it is here.
For sure. I'm fascinated. Yeah. Let's move on. I want to find out. This is a little bit unique. I'm going to let you talk through this for the people at home because I don't want to get anything wrong. We're at the Lautering. What's going on here?
So again, you got to place in the fact we started as a brewery, and most of the equipment here is designed around that.
Absolutely.
Like I said before, we weren't even thinking about a distillery when we put the brew house in.
Yeah.
So the mash, the wash for the distillery has to follow all the same processes.
Right.
So we go into the Lautering, and the Lautering's essentially a big sieve. So once we've been in the mash tun, we've converted all that starch into sugar. We now just need to separate the grain from the liquid, which is what happens in the Lautering.
Fantastic.
So it's got metal plates at the bottom, lots of holes in it. That mash gets pumped in on top of those plates, and the liquid, that wort, then drains off underneath.
Okay.
And then during the process, we also sparge, which is really rinsing through as much of the sugar as we possibly can.
Fantastic. Okay, understood. And I'm noticing this isn't the only big vessel here on this floor. You've got two more. Yeah. Is it all similar processes?
Again, the wash has got to go through. So the Lautering runs to a holding tank, which we call the pre-run tank, and that pre-run tank will then run into the kettle. And we do actually put the wash through the kettle because we do need to sterilize it a little bit. We don't boil it for anywhere near as long as the normal beer washes or the beers we do.
Because it's going to be distilled.
Because for this, we need to still sterilize it because there's still some wild yeast, there's some bacteria in there.
Okay.
And when we go across to the fermentation, I'll show you that we're fermenting in an open vessel in another room, in a room with lots of other beer fermenting.
Right.
So wild yeast, bacteria will get into everything.
Right.
So we do as much as we can to make sure that doesn't happen.
Okay.
So that's the reason we go into the kettle to give the small sterilization.
Fascinating.
Which does mean that we're then highlighting the Adnams yeast strain. We're showing what it does.
Yes.
And that's really what comes through in the final bit whiskey.
Which, as a brewery-made distillery, is quite a great way to, like you say, showcase what's going in to all of your products, really.
Yeah, and I think you can sort of gloss over it, or you can lean into it. So we've decided we want to lean into the things that our process, our way of making whiskey gives us.
Distinctly Adnams process. I love it. Yeah. And it's wonderful to see all of these different bits of equipment can be used across both styles. Really, really, really interesting. Fascinating. Okay, cool. So we've sieved it all out.
Yep.
Where are we going next? Fermentation?
So we're going to go to fermentation, which is, for me, probably the most interesting bit.
I'm very excited to see this because if it's still the same equipment across the brewery and the distillery, I think it's going to be a little bit different.
Adnams is so woven into Southwold that you end up walking from one historic building to another just to get around the distillery. It's a magnificent maze of brewing and distilling, and their fermentation room, well, this is like no other we've seen before. The scale is phenomenal, and it's wonderful to see the similarities and differences with beer and whiskey side by side.
So Fergus, we're in the fermentation room, and I have to say this is a different scale to what I am used to. None of that Oregon pine washbacks. These are big stainless steel tanks. How big are these?
So they'll hold about 300 barrels each.
Okay.
So about sort of 490 hectolitres.
Wow. Big tanks, okay.
Relatively big,
and I see we're standing next to these two in particular. Are these exclusively used for your spirits then?
Yeah, so when we first applied to get the license to distill, we had to tell HMRC specifically what tanks we would use. So we designated these two tanks as the ones we would always use for distilling.
Fantastic. Yes, HMRC can be quite particular,
They
can't
were.
But it doesn't matter whether it's your gin, your vodkas, your whiskies, it's all running through these tanks.
All comes through these two tanks.
Fantastic. And with fermentation of your whiskies, is there anything different that's going on here versus the beer?
So I guess there's a few things because they're designed around beer. So again, the sort of control of fermentation is really important to us. So when we're using our yeast and we're trying to make sure there's some residual sugar, we want to make sure we stop the fermentation at the right point so there's some of that sweetness left in the beer when it actually gets packaged and you balance out the bitterness.
Okay.
So we still utilize some of that control of fermentation. So the temperatures we ferment at are still much warmer than we ferment the beer at. So we'll go up to sort of 35 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
Normal beer would be about sort of 20, give or take, sort of 5 degrees either side.
Right.
But for the wash, we tend to go up a lot higher, but we can still control it at that. So we don't let it free rise completely. We do have glycol jackets on the outside, so we control it.
Okay.
So control of fermentation is really good. I guess the other bits that we do a bit differently for the wash is at the bottom we have what we call a mushroom, which is essentially a standpipe. Okay. And it stops the yeast coming out after it's settled out when we're taking that off to to put into casks or whatever, into beer casks.
Okay.
Whereas for the wash, we don't need that, so we take that mushroom out, so we get as much utilization out of that tank as possible.
Understood.
And I guess the other thing is we never reuse the yeast out of here. As a brewery, we're sort of self-sufficient in yeast.
Yep.
So we're essentially in a yeast farm, and we grow yeast, and we use that yeast in the next batch of beer, and so on. Whereas for the distillery, because it's fermenting up to sort of 8% alcohol, that yeast is really stressed, so we don't reuse that yeast.
Understood. And we're talking about two styles of yeast.
So it's two strains of yeast.
Yep.
So the yeast we use in-house goes back to the 1920s.
Wow, okay.
So we used to go up to a brewery in Norwich called Morgan's Brewery, and we would regularly go up every week to get some of their yeast to brew beer with. And then in the Second World War, that brewery got bombed and then basically never recovered. So we then became self-sufficient in that yeast.
Wow.
So that yeast then became our house yeast.
Okay,
and that's still the
fantastic.
same yeast that we use today. And it's really two different strains, which isn't unusual in ale strains, that they often aren't wholly sort of just one pure culture. They often have other yeast strains in there.
Understood.
But we have this culture that is really Adnams and distinctively Adnams. So when you taste a beer that's brewed with our house yeast, there is a character that comes through, and we hope that character also comes through in the whiskey as well.
Through the whiskey, absolutely. So a yeast strain over 100 years old, exclusive to Adnams, I think that's really, really exciting. When we're talking fermentation times, is there much differentiation between the beer and the whiskey?
Yeah, so beer, minimum 7 days in here.
Yep.
And again, that's partly temperature driven. So we're fermenting at 20 degrees Celsius as opposed to 35. 35 is a lot quicker. Like most biological processes, warmer, quicker.
For sure.
So this typically will ferment out in 4 to 5 days.
Okay.
Usually then we'll be taking it straight out of here back to the distillery.
Okay.
And then another batch will be going in as quickly as we can.
Still a decent long fermentation time.
In whiskey terms, still quite long.
Absolutely. We should be getting loads of esters. Can we open the tank and have a little smell?
can.
I won't dip my head too far in, don't worry.
Yeah, I think, for health and safety purposes, don't take a big deep breath.
Yeah, no, lots of CO2 coming out of
Yeah.
here, but...
Yeah.
Oh, wow, straight away, lots of fruit. I mean...
Yeah, so you should get lots of banana, lots of pear drop in there, a little bit of strawberry sometimes as well.
Yeah, a little bit of banana, pears definitely. I'm getting a bit of pineapple myself. But my God, that is absolutely beautiful. And it looks great as well.
Yeah, so I think we've sort of often shied away from it, but our yeast strain is actually quite Belgian in its characteristics. So those big esters, those big bananas, those big pear drops, that's what our yeast wants to make.
Right.
And actually by fermenting warmer, we encourage it to make loads more of those.
Fantastic.
And then hopefully we can capture some of those in the final whiskey as well.
Absolutely. So we're moving from here onto the distillation process now.
Yeah,
We're
so-
finally moving away from the beer and getting on to the spirits.
Yeah, once we get to the distillery, you won't hear me talk about beer anymore.
Hey, listen, I love hearing
Alright.
about beer. It's a little bit different for me, so it's really, really interesting. Let's see what goes into changing this into the whiskies that we know and love from Adnams, though. I'm normally used to coming from fermentation to a low wine still.
Yep.
This is a little bit different.
It's a little bit different. And again, if you go back to the reason we put a distillery in, we didn't actually put it in to make whiskey, we put it in to make gin.
Right, okay.
But we wanted to make gin from scratch.
Okay.
And to make gin from scratch, you've got to make vodka.
Yes.
So we've got column stills in here and a rectifying sort of column stills next door. And really their purpose was to get from 7-8% of the wash up to as high and as pure as quickly as possible.
Absolutely.
But obviously that once you've got a distillery, no matter who you are, obviously you start making whiskey at some point.
It's great to see it.
inevitable.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this is a continuous column still acting as your low wines.
Acting as low wines, yes.
And so I can only imagine that this gets up to a seriously high strength. Normally you're seeing, low wines 20, 25, maybe 30%.
Yeah.
What are we coming off of this at?
So we're about 75% coming off here.
Wow.
And obviously that's
different.
its job. Its job is to go from 7-8 as high as quickly as possible.
All the way up. Okay, lots of reflux. And what are we going to see from a sort of a flavor profile of the distillate coming off of this still? Is it something that you can sort of see certain characteristics within the whiskey, or do you really then need to put it through your next whiskey still?
Really what we see is you're not losing very much. So this process, it's not separating out a lot of things, apart from the fact it's taking out a lot of the water and concentrating the alcohols. But all the esters, all those other profiles, all those flavor compounds,
they remain?
They should remain.
Okay.
So I think that's what we see from it.
Okay.
And then obviously we try and enhance that at the sort of at the fermentation stage and at the whiskey stage as well.
Fantastic. So tell me a little bit about the runs that you do through this. What's the capacity capacity.
So we'll brew a wash of about sort of 250 barrels, 300 barrels, and we'll get through that in 3 or 4 days, running continuously, runs overnight, runs with fairly little interference really.
Okay.
As long as it stays within parameters, it runs all the time.
Cool.
So it's a very simple, really efficient bit of kit. I think obviously that I don't know if you noticed, but where we are, this is an old building, which used to be where the coppers for the brewery used to be.
Right.
So part of the sort of decision around what equipment we went in sort of worked with the space we had.
For sure.
And column stills coming up through this giant gap where the copper used to be.
Absolutely.
Made a lot of sense.
It made sense. Cool. Okay. Very interesting. Very interesting. So then, regardless whether it's your gin, your vodka, your whiskey, it's all running through this continuous column still.
Yeah.
What's then next that makes that whiskey unique? Is there a set whiskey still?
Yeah, so we've got a whiskey still and a set gin still as well. So initially we had the vodka pot that we fed the rectifying columns. We could disconnect and use that as whiskey or as gin. Okay. But it has plates. It gives us 2 cleaner profiles. So pretty early on in the process, we decided we needed a dedicated whiskey still. And that's what we've got, and that's what I'm going to see next.
Okay, let's have a look. We're now at the specialized whiskey still.
Yep.
Everything to this point is, very diverse. It can be used for all of your Adnams products, which I love. It's been really, really interesting walking around and learning. But this is all about the whiskey.
This is whiskey.
Tell me a little bit about this. What size still are we at here?
So it's about 700 litres capacity.
Okay.
So we're running this usually sort of twice a day.
Okay.
And it runs fairly continuously at the moment because we're in this period where we're putting down a lot of whiskey.
Absolutely. And how much whiskey are we talking per annum here, roughly?
So we'll do about 200,000 litres this year.
Okay.
It won't always be like that, and everyone's used to whiskey. There are peaks and troughs in every whiskey sort of distillery's life, but we're in a bit of sort of a peak at the moment in terms of production.
Fantastic. I mean, 200,000 litres, it's a lot of whiskey, but at the same time, for a product that's going the world over, people really want to grab hold of the Adnams whilst they can and make sure that you guys are continuing to increase that output year on year, right?
Yeah, and it's one of the real challenges actually going from a brewery to a distillery. We're used to having products with shelf lives.
Yes.
There's no point producing too much because it will go off before you can sell it. With whiskey, where do you end?
Yes.
When do you decide you've made enough?
Right.
How do you know what you're going to sell in 10, 20, 30 years' time?
There's never enough.
No. Well, depends what time you're at.
That's very true, very true. So I'm noticing the unique shape of this still more than anything.
Yeah.
Is this for reflux? What's the thought process behind that?
I'd like to give you a really detailed explanation of what it is, but the truth is, John, our head distiller, who was picking out the whiskey still at the time, liked the shape of it, and that is probably as complicated as the decision was.
It's a romantic one then.
It's a romantic one. He was out shopping for stills with Jonathan Adnams, and he said, "I like the shape of that one. Let's get that one."
Now, obviously, John McCarthy was the head distiller here until last year, when he very sadly passed away. A massive loss for the team here, and we were so sorry to hear of that. What's moving forward for Adnams looking like? Because obviously he was the main man here when it came to all things whiskey and all your wonderful spirits. Yeah. Are you training up the next generation now? Who's taking...
Well, I guess thankfully John had started doing that himself. So we've got 2 distillers, another John and Dan, and they do the distillations day in, day out, and they were doing that when John was here as well.
Fantastic.
So he has already started that process of training up a successor, and we sort of want to give them the room to grow into that role as much as possible, which sort of follows on in John's footsteps, really. So John came here as an electrician. He was here well before the distillery was even a thought process.
Wow, he was an electrician?
He was an electrician.
Become whiskey maker.
Yeah, so he was part of the team looking at doing this as a sort of project implementation.
Right.
And he said, actually, who's going to run this? I'll go away and learn how to distill.
Amazing.
And he did. So we like the idea that actually that's going to pass on to the next generation.
And ultimately, his fingerprints are over this distillery forevermore now.
And particularly with whiskey, it's one of the beautiful things about whiskey, I think, is that as what he's made is going to last us for years.
Yes.
And every time we go and find another cask in the cellar, it'll be something else. We go, well, John made that.
Absolutely lovely. So we came off the continuous column stills at about 75, which, like I say, for a low wine is crazy high. I love it. Really, really unique. We're going into the whiskey still now. What are we looking at for distillation times here, run times, cut points, and what's it coming off the stills at?
So we'll typically run about 70 litres an hour.
Okay.
And we're aiming for sort of the low 80s, sort of high 70s in terms of ABV coming off. And I think what we're really looking for is, and we sort of talked about it before, that we want to showcase what the yeast is doing.
Yes.
You know, that ester profile. It's really where we want to try and get into those whiskies. And I think when you taste the whiskies, you do see that sort of fruit profile coming through, and that is really because we're trying to maintain those fruits going through the process. And I think that's what you'll find in the whiskies, and that's really what. And it's essentially this is a brandy head. That's the shape of it, and that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to enhance that sort of fruit profile.
Understood.
So that's really what we're trying to do.
Okay, fantastic. So, sorry, it's coming off of here at what strength then?
So sort of 79 to 81 is sort of typically what we're doing.
Okay, wow, 79 to 81. And then moving across after this, hopefully we'll be able to see a filling room or a warehouse?
Yeah, so we'll show you where the whiskey's stored. We'll show you what we're doing, a little bit of bottling.
Okay, well, I'll save my questions about filling strengths for there then. Is there anything else that we can, I'm still kind of mesmerized by the shape of this. It's really quite unique. Is there anything else for the people at home that we can highlight here?
I can't think of anything else.
No?
I think it's just that idea that we want to preserve what's been made in fermentation.
Yes.
And I think often when we talk to the whiskey distilleries, fermentation isn't as big a concern, it isn't as big a part of their flavor profile, but for us it is, because we are trying to show the point of using this this Adnams yeast.
Yes.
And I guess historically it wasn't unusual to use ale yeast in making whiskey. People have moved away from that more towards using strains that are much more sort of alcohol tolerant.
Yes.
They're doing a lot more that, they're converting as much of that sugar into alcohol as possible. Whereas we're knowingly using an ale yeast that doesn't like converting all the sugar. We're knowingly doing that. And so we have to back ourselves that actually we're doing that for a reason.
Yes.
And the reason is to make sure that flavor comes through from fermentation.
Quality over quantity, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely, I love it. Fantastic. Okay, cool. And out of interest, last little question before we move on. Is there any difference between the different styles of whiskey? Your rye, your triple malt, your single malt, at this distillation process?
We run them pretty similarly.
Okay.
I think we do go for a little bit higher on the single malt in terms of ABV, and a little bit lower on the rye and triple malt. Partly because we know they're going to age a bit longer as well.
Okay.
Whereas the single malt was always going to be the workhorse of the distillery. It was always going to be the one that, as soon as it gets to whiskey age, then it would be whiskey.
That core range product, yeah.
Where that has obviously stretched out over time, and we are at a sort of higher age now. But yeah, that's the only difference really.
Fantastic. I love it. This is very romantic. Beautiful, beautiful still. Let's move on and see where it's filled. We are finally at one of my favorite parts of any distillery tour, the warehouse, where all of our whiskey is laying at rest, waiting for the day that it's ready for bottling.
Yes.
Tell us what's going on in here. What sort of casks are we using for the Adnams whiskies?
So going back to when we came from being a brewery to a distillery, we sort of decided to make up some of our own rules a little bit. So originally we decided we would go for new oak to start with.
Okay.
Because the idea being we'd get a bit more age, that process would be a bit quicker, and we'd get to that point of having whiskey to sell quicker than otherwise.
Punching in loads of flavour, loads of colour, really early on.
Exactly that. And also the fact that we're not a Scottish distillery. We're geographically challenged in that respect. So there's no point trying to mimic what other people are doing.
Definitely.
So we thought we'd do something a little bit different. So we went for new French oak, new American oak, primarily new French. So our single malt's all aged in French oak.
Fantastic.
Apart from a little bit that we blend in with the ex-bourbon. So initially we didn't do any ex-bourbon filling. That came sort of later on. But we did do some to give us some more tunes to play when you come to that blending stage. So having all our eggs in the sort of French oak medium toasted basket doesn't give you too many tunes you can play.
Variety is the spice of life.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Exactly.
Fantastic.
So a couple of years into doing that, we sort of added a lot more ex-bourbon to give us some of those tunes to play.
Cool.
And then for the rye whiskey is also French oak, although it's called European oak, but it's still French species. And then for the triple malt, the sort of wheat whiskey, we age that in American oak. So it gives it a slightly different profile.
Okay, just softer tannins.
Softer tannins, a bit more coconut comes through. So so all the sort of classic thing, and a bit more of that spicy characteristic you sort of tend to get with American.
Lovely, fantastic. Okay, and is it just whiskey in here? I'm noticing, is it some apple brandy up there?
We've got some apple brandy.
Okay.
We've got some wine brandy.
Okay.
Which we in-house and will never leave the four walls of Adnams, but is COVID wine brandy.
Okay.
So wine that went out of condition over COVID, we thought, well, why waste it? Let's distill it. And so there's only a handful of casks. It's 2 casks, I think, across the whole range.
I love it.
But yeah, we've had lots of things coming through this process at one point.
Wonderful. And so how many casks of whiskey are coming off of the Adnams stills on a weekly, monthly basis at the moment?
So we're sort of making, I'll have to work it out in my head now. So we're making about 10,000 litres sort of every 2 weeks or so.
Okay.
So that's the sort of volume. And we're then diluting down to about 65% to go into cask.
Right, okay.
So that's the sort of volumes we're sort of talking about.
So I was just about to ask as well, yeah, exactly that. We've obviously come from the stills there at a big whopping high strength, particularly like you say, you look at what's going on in Scotland, you are doing things completely different here, which I love. It's always nice to see something a little bit new. 65%, is that kind of following the vague industry standard of sort of mid-60s?
Yeah, it's the standard. I think it's nothing more complicated than that. We're sort of stood in our dunnage, which has a quite nice cool temperature. So we're not dealing with sort of casks that are stood outside where you're going to get huge amounts of temperature fluctuations. Right. So 65% following the standard seemed to make sense to us.
Happy days. And I'm assuming that this isn't all the whiskey you've got maturing. No. We're not running out of Adnams this badly, are we?
No. This is a very small bit of it.
For sure. So this is just what's on site.
Yeah, it's what's on site. So we do store some of it elsewhere in England.
Okay.
In a dedicated whiskey store.
Fantastic.
Whereas this actually used to be an Adnams shop when I first joined. So it's been converted into a small whiskey store with a little bottling hall. But we needed a bit more space for the whiskey that we're coming off the still.
Fantastic. And so, sorry, you're actually bottling all of your products here as well?
Most of them now, apart from our Copperhouse gin.
Okay.
Again, going back, the distillery was really built on gin. That's its primary sort of reason for being. So our main gin product we send away for bottling because the volumes are too big, but mostly everything else is bottled here.
Amazing. And it's nice and cool, nice and calm. This is what I love about whiskey warehouses and as well. A beautiful smell, still getting lots of those esters that we've had at different parts. It's a bit more toned down in here, but
definitely.
You can definitely smell it seeping out of those casks.
I think if you smell it too much, we've got a problem.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. But it is making me thirsty. Or are we at the point where maybe we can sit down and have a dram?
1 or 2, maybe.
Yeah? Fantastic. Show the way.
Let's go.
So Fergus, we've finished our lovely distillery tour. Thank you for showing me around. And where are we now? This is the tasting room at the end of all tours, is it?
Yeah, so we run brewery and distillery tours, and this is where the distillery tour is finished to have obviously the most important bit is what it tastes like.
Have a little sample, fantastic, okay. Obviously we've seen the production process. You guys are putting out such a range of styles, flavors, etc., etc. I mean, what is it about Adnams now that you're trying to push moving forward? Is it that range making whiskies and gins and vodkas and all of it very accessible to everybody?
Yeah, so I think particularly on the whiskey, it is about that core range. It is about talking about the single malt and the things people recognise.
Yes.
But I think we also do some really interesting things that maybe not everyone sort of is as aware of. So something like the rye whiskey or the wheat whiskey actually are styles that lots of people aren't immediately aware of what they actually mean.
Right.
So I think actually getting people to taste those and actually understand what they mean is really important as well.
Absolutely. And obviously you're now 10 years into distillation here at Adnams,
so 2010 we started.
So so a
bit longer.
Wow, 15 years. Okay, phenomenal. Yeah. And I mean, over 150 years since the Adnams name sort of took over here in Southwold.
Yeah, exactly.
So 15 years into distillation. Sorry, I got that wrong. What's it looking like moving ahead now? Are you looking to focus on age statements, or are these core range products really where you want people to start off?
So age statements is a really interesting question, because I think when we first started, like any young distillery, you don't want to talk about age statements because they don't mean anything. They're too young.
For sure.
But as we've sort of progressed through, we now have our single malt is bottled at 10 years old.
Okay.
And we put a little neck label around to say it's 10 years old because previously we hadn't made any age statement on it.
Sorry, that's the blue core range product.
Yeah, the blue core range, and it's not every bottle that's out there. Literally about 2 months ago it got bottled, so that is now 10 years old.
But for people at home, they're going to be able to start seeing that age statement.
So we have this nice maturing sort of stock of whiskey that we can actually start making some more interesting age statements than it's just about legal.
Yes.
Now it is actually some interesting ages.
And out of interest, are you seeing the flavour changing as that age develops?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's always, when you first start a distillery and you're making whiskey, there's always this pressure to get whiskey out as soon as you can legally call it whiskey.
Yes.
But actually, the flavour change from 3 to 7 to 10 to 12 is quite phenomenal, really.
Yes.
And there are things, the things you can do to sort of increase the sort of the rate of aging, but actually time is still really important part of it.
Yeah. You can kind of use smaller casks, try those microwaving techniques, so to speak.
Exactly.
But at the end of the day,
but time,
nothing beats time.
Yeah, time is still a crucial factor, and I think you only really understand that when you go through that process.
Yes. So really one of the key distilleries here in England leading that kind of English whiskey wave. Do you see yourselves as an English whiskey distillery, or are you really just focused on the products that you're putting out?
I think a bit of both, really. We like the provenance, and not just English. We like the fact it's here, it's Southwold, it's the East Coast, that we use grain from East Anglia. It's all from Norfolk and Suffolk, and that we know who's growing it. So that sense of place is really important. So we absolutely value the fact that we're an English whiskey distillery. But I think because we're out on the coast, we've always done things a little bit independently. There is always a sort of Adnams sort of way of doing it. So we obviously we're a brewery to start with, so we still think of ourselves as a brewery as well as everything else.
Right. Yeah.
So all that sort of all the sort of backstory does feed into how we do things and why we do them.
Yes. And I see you've selected the rye malt to talk about here now at the end of the tour today. Why the rye malt as opposed to the single malt or the triple?
I think partly because we talked a little bit about the provenance, where we are, why we do things, and the rye malt sort of showcases this probably much more than anything else. So the rye is grown in Raiden, which is just the next village to Southwold.
Very much of the place then.
And Raiden in Old English means rye on the hill. So beautiful story that it comes from there.
Okay.
But then then we sort of guilt it a little bit more by the fact that Jonathan Adnams grows the rye. So the rye that we use to make the rye wash and make the rye whiskey actually comes from Jonathan Adnams' farm.
Okay.
So we've got and every year we go and walk his field and try and pick out where the ergot is and see how bad it is that year.
Right.
But so we have a really nice sort of tie into exactly what happens to that grain.
So that's probably the most Adnams product you could have.
Yeah, it doesn't really get more Adnams than this one.
Cool. Okay. Fantastic. Let's have a little go. And 47% I'm noticing here.
Yeah.
Are all 3 core range products at the 47?
No, so the rye and the triple malt are 47, the single malt's 40.
Okay. And what's the thought process there? Is it a specific sort of level that you're really aiming at, or?
I think particularly with the single malt, we wanted to get something that's more accessible, something people are more used to, and that was sort of the starting point, 15 years ago. Whereas with the rye and triple malt, because they're a little bit unusual, I think, for most whiskey drinkers in the UK, we thought actually that they can stand a bit more ABV and a bit more interest.
For sure, fantastic. I have to say, as I was again saying to you off camera earlier, sometimes I struggle with ryes, bourbons, ryes. Yeah. Sometimes a flavour profile that I do struggle with. What I love about your one is the balance. You do have those beautiful rye spices that are immediately punching through, but also those softer vanillins. Yeah. It seems to be a 47%, just so well balanced from an alcohol point of view. It's definitely a whiskey. It's almost sort of, I would say it's leaning towards a whiskey of significant sort of age because of that, the way the alcohol sits.
Yeah, so I think this one probably would have been bottled at 7 years old. So it's got some decent age, not sort of high end, but some of them decent.
But I'd say it sings above 7 years old. It tastes a little bit older in my opinion. And I think the reason for that is the way the alcohol sits in the glass and the balance of those flavors. Also the texture. Really, really important. We don't talk about texture enough, I think. And that really wonderful sort of smooth and creamy to begin with, but you get that rye bite at the end, a little bit of astringency.
Yeah, and we like that sort of spicy, that sort of harsher edge to the rye.
Yes.
And we do age this in French oak, so you get a lot of vanilla as well.
Right.
And it's new French oak, so I probably should have said that at the start, but it's new French, so you get a lot of vanilla.
That makes sense. I was going to say, normally you don't get that level of vanillins within ryes, and sometimes that's the thing. I think it can be unbalanced towards that rye spice, which is something I obviously struggle with on a personal level, but this is really, really wonderful. So about 7 years old.
Yeah.
Is this one that's soon going to have a little neck tag with an age statement on it? Or?
So I think the next bottling of this probably would be 9 years old, I think.
Okay. Fantastic.
Yeah, so they're stepping up all the time.
Absolutely. I mean, the great thing about it is age isn't the focus. So if people have been buying this product for years now and they start seeing these neck tags coming along, it's exciting to see this product that I know and love is developing, but ultimately the flavor should stay fairly consistent, correct?
Fairly consistent, but I think we're not not wholly focused on on it being the same every time. I think we like a bit of that age showing through, and we like a bit of journey. Yeah. So I think if hopefully the customer comes, our drinkers come along with us on that journey. But just making sure they know at what point that is, I think, is important.
Fantastic. Well, I have to say, it's absolutely delicious, and what a beautiful place that we are sat in. It's been an amazing tour. I can only encourage people at home now to come along and delve in themselves. It's certainly a shame that it's all come to an end. I'll probably hang around here a little bit longer if that's all right, off camera, and dive into more of the whiskies. But really, really appreciate you showing us around here today, learning all about Adnams, and I cannot wait to watch as these products continue to grow, age, develop, and as the brand does so as well. Brilliant. So here's to Adnams. Sláinte. From beer to whiskey and spirits of all styles, every corner of Adnams reflects the passion and deep respect that they have for their craft and their community. It's not just the spirit in the cask, it's the spirit of Southwold itself.